my name is Miss Zai. I'll be your English teacher for this year. I thought I'd record a couple of catch-up lessons for those who will be away for the next 2 weeks. For this week, we have only just explored the listening paper, discussed a couple of strategies, how to break down the question, because you only get 30 minutes to listen and write at the same time. You want to maximize your time and be able to answer the questions properly, because the paper is out of 15 and it is an easy 15 marks to get if you practice. Okay, so I would like you to go on to Google Classroom, scroll down to the very bottom, just read my introduction. Those are just like, who I am, some simple class rules I have, and why you should be checking Google Classroom all the time. And then if you scroll up, you'll see that there's a link to the weekly schedule, which looks like this, and I will be writing, updating every lesson what we do and some reminders. I will also have to fix this a little bit because we didn't get much done for the first week. It was a little bit too hot as well. And then if you scroll further up, our first lesson, we looked at the 2013 HSC listening paper with the listening skills tips. So these are the two that you need to download right now and print, because you will be required to make notes on your paper. So have colored pens ready, have a highlighter ready. And as for this one, this is kind of like your cheat sheet if you think about it. It will tell you what you need to do in terms of, what you're supposed to look out for and what you need to consider. Don't worry about the rest for now. And then the second day on Friday, we looked at visual techniques and an introduction to Module A, which is the topic, the focus for this term. Okay, so for the purpose of this recording, I'll try and keep it to half an hour. And I will be explaining and breaking down the 2013 HSC listening paper. Also, every time I upload something onto Google Classroom, it will automatically go into Google Drive here. So you can go to Google Drive, your classroom, the name of our classroom, and everything will be here. It's messy now, but I will make sure to organize them into folders so that you can easily find them. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through this paper. With any recording, anything that you listen to, you need to think about the purpose. Why are they speaking? Then you need to think about context. So I'll give you some time right now to read through it. Okay, so think about why, and then you have to think about the situation. What are they talking about? Is it a formal or informal speaking situation? Is it like a proper interview where they're interviewing maybe a politician? Or are they talking to like a famous person and talking about that person's personal experiences? Who is it for? Could be public, could be personal, one person, many people. It could be targeted towards children. Could be targeted towards people who work as a taxi driver, for example. Could be targeted towards teachers or students. The style of language as well. So these are kind of like techniques. Style of language is very important because that gives you a feeling of whether it is formal or informal, and also the tone. There's only 6 words here to describe tone, but there's much, much more. And this is something I'm going to teach you throughout the year. And any new words that I teach you, make sure in your book to highlight them in a different color and write a translation at the top. You can do it in your own language or even write the English translation. It's up to you. Oral techniques. For those who do music, oral techniques are about speaking. Oral is the mouth. So when you speak, what pitch are you using? Pitch is high or low. Tone goes back to this. Pace, how fast, how slow? Does it change? Sometimes when you speak in an excited tone, you talk a little bit quicker. Your pitch might go higher. But if you're talking in a very serious tone, you might slow down a bit and your pitch might be lower. Stress and emphasis is about when you say a sentence, there might be one word that you would heavily emphasize. Like, for example, don't eat that food. Or did you break the chair? So see how I'm putting the emphasis on don't or placing the emphasis on break. Pausing, stopping for a little bit. Volume, how loud or soft. Sound effects can be natural. So they might like play some sounds of birds singing in the background or the sound of a car driving by. Gives you that sense of environment. It's very immersive. Immersive meaning it's almost like trying to take you to that environment, that setting. And if you close your eyes, you can kind of like feel as if you're there. Added sounds, so music sometimes. And then at the bottom, you can read this on your own, but basically it just says that listening is an active skill. Okay, so you need to actually pay attention. So think about those moments where you're maybe too busy thinking about something else while your mum is talking to you, for example. Okay, so we are now going back to the 2013 paper. Please ignore all my scribbles. I'll leave this for now. Okay. If you look at the cover page, this is how the HSC listening paper looks like. There's another 2 papers that you do have to complete. But this one is the one we're focusing today. There's 15 marks in total. You have to attempt questions 1 to 6. You get 30 minutes working time, including reading and listening. It goes by, 30 minutes can go by very quickly, but if you use the strategies that I teach you, you'll be fine. Okay, so make sure you're using a pen. Okay, make sure that you have your pen and highlighter ready because we are about to do some note taking. Okay, so over here, again, total marks and so forth. Over here is how you'll be assessed. So really this will be the same for each year's HSC paper. This part is the most important, so I need you to pay close attention. When you sit in the exam room, they will play a recording of this. So someone on the CD will read this out to you. These are the instructions and they give you context for what you're about to hear. So you're about to hear an extract, which means it's taken out of something as a whole. Let me just change the... Okay, oops. Just gonna get rid of that. All right. Sorry, I'm just gonna move this. Okay. So you're about to hear an extract from a radio interview. So this tells you where. The radio interview from an ABC program. That's the name of the interview. In this extract, we hear Richard Feidler interview. So this is the guy who is like the host. And who is he interviewing? Nick Vujicic. So Nick Vujicic is the subject or the focus of this interview. So that means that you'll hear two voices in the recording. Sometimes they might only ever play one voice because it can be a speech. And Nick is a 29-year-old man who was born without arms or legs. So again, over here, we get a little bit of context. Then it says, before you hear the recording, you get 2 minutes to read the questions printed in this paper. So during that 2 minutes, the CD will actually go silent and you get time to read through it. I suggest you use those 2 minutes very wisely, because if you're able to read through the questions and kind of have an understanding of what do you have to listen out for first, and you don't have to complete these questions in the order that they're written. Most people do, but whatever you remember first, you kind of jump to. Then it says, as you're listening to the recording, you can follow the instructions. You can write notes if you want in the candidate's note spaces, which is here. They're on pages 2 to 4. This is like your working out paper, like in maths, when you scribble some notes and stuff like that. But anything you write here will not be marked. So even if you put the correct answer here, we will not give you marks from here. You'll hear the recording. The questions will be read aloud. You'll hear the recording a second time, and then you'll be given time to write the answers. You now have 2 minutes to read the questions. So basically, this is how it goes. In the CD recording, the first thing the person's going to do is read this to you. They'll read this word by word, and you follow on carefully. You can pick up your pen to highlight, underline, make notes. Afterwards, the recording goes silent for 2 minutes, and you get time to read all the questions. Make sure you turn over your questions so that you don't forget to answer the questions on the last 2 pages. After your 2 minutes is up, they will start playing the recording. They will say, you will now hear the recording. So during that recording, the first time, you are allowed to write notes. I strongly recommend that you don't, that you listen just for the first time. Otherwise, you will get confused, you will panic, and then you will miss out on important information. After the first recording, the person will read the questions, every single one, to you. Question 1. Why does Nick call his foot my chicken drumstick? So they'll read all the questions to you, and then afterwards you'll hear the recording for a second time, and you can write notes in your note spaces. You just write words, don't write full sentences in the note spaces. You're wasting time. Just write keywords. You can even label the numbers as well so that you kind of remember later on to match up the questions. After the second time, you get time to write your answers. So for question 1, it's 1 mark. Normally the questions start out easy, 1 or 2 marks, and they become harder towards the end. And usually the first 1 or 2 questions is kind of like a comprehension question, which is you listen out for the answer. Okay, or you make an inference, which means you kind of like the answer is not exactly said to you, but you kind of like a detective. You guess correctly how the person's feeling or whatever based on the information you're given. So question 1, why does Nick call his foot my chicken drumstick? As you can see, you've got 2 lines. The amount of lines they print for you is an indication of, like, you know, how much you can write. Try not to go over the lines. You could write in this space here, okay? But you really shouldn't be. It is only 1 mark and you would be wasting time. Unless you wrote something wrong and you want to write your correct answer, cross it out. Don't ever use liquid tape, liquid paper. There's no time for that. We don't care if you cross things out. We're just looking for the answer. And because it's only 1 mark, you don't have to start off with Nick calls his foot my chicken drumstick because. Just start off with because. That saves you time. This question clearly means that you just listen out for the answer. And this speech mark means it's a quote that he said. So you will need to listen to him saying it. Question 2, why is the reaction of Nick's mother's to his birth ironic? So this is a why question. Why questions are meant to give reasons. Because it's 2 marks, I'll tell you where your marks should be coming from. And also because it says reaction of, it means Nick's mother's reaction. So Nick will be talking about his mum and what her reaction to his birth. So what is her reaction to when she gave birth to him? Ironic. This is a word you need to know. Ironic comes from the word irony, which means it's a form of humor where you say something or do something that contradicts who you are or your values. So for example, I'm a teacher, and if I say to you, I hate children or I don't like children, then you will say, well, miss, that's ironic because you are a teacher and your job requires you to teach children. If you hear a chef say, I hate food, then you would say that's ironic because your job, you're required to like food, and your job, you know, you work with food. So Nick's mother, we don't know who she is before we listen to the recording. So he will actually talk about her. You need to find out a bit about what Nick's mother does for a living or who she is as a person. That's 1 mark because that will tell you the irony. The second mark comes from the first mark comes from Nick's mother, what she does and what her reaction was. That's 1 mark. You need to say, what did she do? How did she react? React meaning like, you know, were you scared of it or were you excited? Were you surprised? That's reaction, your response. To his birth, okay? Ironic. And then you have to explain why is it ironic. If you don't explain why it's ironic, you will only get 1 mark, because you are only doing half the answer. Okay, so question 3 for 2 marks. There's different types of explain questions. If it says explain what something blah 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 means when he or she says quote, then that means it's kind of easy in the sense that you need to consider, and I'm just going to bring up that paper again. You need to consider context. Where and when is the language being used? When did he say this? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. So listen out for that. What did he say before? What did he say after? What's he talking about here? So for 2 marks, you need to explain a little bit in detail. What does he mean when he says that? So what happened? Why is he saying that? Other questions that say explain how means analysis. So you need techniques, you need evidence. And often the how questions will give you a focus area. So we move on to question 4, and this is what I'm talking about. If it says how does or in what ways does, that's usually a technique question, because it says in what ways does Nick communicate his attitude towards his life. So as you can see, you need to focus on his attitude towards what? His life. All right? Attitude meaning how he feels about it. Attitude can be in different categories: positive, neutral, or negative. Neutral meaning in the middle. If it's positive, if he has a positive attitude towards his life, then you need to begin with a topic sentence. So when you have questions that are around 3-4 marks, and it's usually a how question or explain how or in what ways, that requires you to have evidence and to analyze that evidence, then you need a proper peel paragraph to structure your answer properly. So your point would be to first identify what is his attitude towards his life. You need to identify the focus. You can't just say, Nick communicates his attitude towards his life, full stop, because you haven't told me what is his attitude towards his life. So for example, if I say Nick has a positive attitude towards his life, full stop, I will need to explain a little bit more. Positive in what sense? Because positive is such a broad word. Anything can be positive. Grateful, happiness, and so forth. So he's grateful that he's alive and healthy. By the way, I am slightly making these answers up just for the purpose of showing you how it should be structured. After your point, you always give an evidence. You can, when you do your evidence and explanation, you can put your technique in front of the evidence, or your evidence first and then your technique. Or you put the technique and your evidence in the same sentence, it doesn't matter. As long as the evidence and explanation is in the middle, not at the start. He uses humor, that's a technique, for example. And I've gone back here, style of language. Or he uses a metaphor, he uses a simile. Those are also language techniques that have not exactly been included on this paper, because those are the things that people instantly think of, but these are the things that people often forget. To show, to create, to emphasize, blah, blah, blah. For example, he says, and that's your evidence. I personally like to put my evidence first. For example, he says, and then I put the quote. Your quote does not have to be an entire full sentence that he says, because obviously you won't be able to remember it. It can be part of a sentence, or if your technique are things like positive adjectives or negative adjectives or compliments or derogatory language, then you can just include words, but put them in quotes to show that he said that. And then you talk about the technique and the effect of that. Your link should be, therefore, Nick's positive attitude towards his life is communicated through the language techniques he uses. But really, you don't really have to do a link, because it's not an essay. It is a listening test. So the first 3 are the most important: your point in the topic sentence, your evidence, and your explanation. Make sure you turn over to the next page so that you don't forget to answer the last 2 questions. Question 5. What insight have you gained about Nick from retelling the fight? This is a 3-mark question. So insight means if I say I've gained some insight from you, it means I've learned something from you. So what did you learn about Nick when he retells the fight? Not a fight, but the fight, which means you need to listen out for him telling us a story about a fight he was involved in, or maybe he saw. So you need to listen carefully to what he says. And about Nick means his personality or his behavior or his attitude or his character. What did you learn about him as a person? So this is something, it's like, what is your impression of Nick? Or even what is your opinion about Nick? When you have a question like that, what insight have you gained? You need to support with evidence, which means quotes. If you can't exactly remember the quotes, you can paraphrase and say, I learned this when Nick was talking about or told us about what he, blah, 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 what he did. Okay? Or when I learned this when Nick punched a guy. So that's paraphrasing, which means you're not directly quoting because you can't remember the exact words he said, but you do remember that he did punch a guy. So that's still part of your evidence. As long as you have evidence, you'll be fine. So that's 3 marks. Now, even though this is not a technique question, you still need to include evidence. And you do need some sort of structure. So you do need to begin with something like, I learned, or you can say we learned, or you can say the audience learns that Nick is a blah, 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 blah person. Okay? So you need to open up with your topic sentence to describe his character. And then you say, in your next sentence, for example, this is evident when he says, you include the quote. Or this is evident when he, action, what did he do? And remember, it has to be about that fight. Okay, question 6. I'll give you a quick minute to read that question on your own. Okay, so for 4 marks, the last question is always the hardest, but it can be easy if you know what to look out for. So again, what have I been talking about? I've been talking about breaking down that question. What is the question asking you to do? And what is the question asking you to focus on? This is another how question. How means techniques. Who? Richard Feidler is the interviewer. Encourage the audience, which is us. So how does Richard make us feel a sense of admiration for Nick? Admiration comes from the word to admire. If you don't know this word, I suggest that you learn it, highlight it, put the translation above. Admire means to look up to someone, to respect them, because they are positive, hopefully, positive people that you want to become or that you want to follow. But admire means someone that you respect, to respect someone. So if I were to make this question shorter, the question would be, how does Richard Feidler make us admire Nick? And it's through, obviously, the way he speaks about Nick and to Nick, isn't it? So if you look here, pay attention to Richard Feidler's language. Is he descriptive? Does he use emotive words? Does he use humor? What's his tone like? Because tone can reflect your attitude. Does he use oral techniques? Like, does he stress? or put emphasis on words? Does he pause every now and then? Sound effects don't really apply to this because number one, there's no music, because it's just two people talking. So you don't need to worry about that. Okay, again, 4 marks. It's a how question, requires techniques. There's a lot of lines, so that's another indication. Oops. You need to have a structured response, a peel paragraph. Like back in question 4, you need to start off with having a focus. Your point, the audience, or you can say we, feel a sense of admiration for Nick. Okay, they respect Nick because, that's my example. Again, you have to think about, they admire Nick in what way? What is it about Nick that people admire, that people respect, people look up to? Is he hardworking? Is it because he has no arms and legs, and he, even though in his situation he has a disadvantage, he still has a positive attitude? Or he is a kind person? And then your evidence. So here in my example, I've incorporated the technique with the evidence. Fiedler uses, now again, I'm using the last name, the last name of the interviewer. Don't use the first name, just use the last name because it's more formal. However, if you do use the first name, you're not going to get marked down, it's okay. Fiedler uses positive adjectives, that's my techniques, such as generous in quote. That's a quote. That's a word that Fiedler says. Again, I'm making these answers up, so you need to listen to the recording to write your own answers. And note that I've only used one word, and that's okay because my technique is just adjectives. So if you wanted to, you could even include more. So what other things Fiedler says? Maybe Fiedler says kind. Maybe Fiedler says respectful. So it can include some more adjectives that Fiedler uses. You don't have to just do one. I would even suggest do 2 or 3. So for example, Fiedler uses positive adjectives such as generous, kind, and respectful. And then I explain, what's the effect of this? If he's using these words, how does that, create, what kind of image does that create in our mind? Well, they're compliments, and they portray Nick as an admirable person. And if it's 4 marks, I suggest that you include more than one example to support your answer. So if you include another one, your next sentence will be in addition, or you can use the word also, or you can use the word furthermore. Fiedler does what? What does he say? Fiedler does this, blah, 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 and then you explain in the next sentence. And that is the end of the paper. So I hope that's been helpful. Keep in mind that if you do run out of time, you can use dot points, but that is not a habit that you should have at the beginning. You should be writing in full sentences. But again, have a little bit more common sense. If you have a simple question like this, you can just write your answer because blah, blah, blah. But if you get a question like question 4, or even question 6 that require peel paragraph, then you need to, have a structure. So remember, what you need to take away from this is a question. When you look at a question, you need to think about, what is it asking you to do? Is it asking you to explain? Is it asking you what? And a what question is usually identified unless it says, what does it mean when he says? But usually the question will be more specific and say explain instead of what does it mean. So you look at the instruction, the what, the why, the explain, the how. That's the instruction of the question. But then the focus. What do you need to focus on? What do you need to look out for? Remember to practice listening, practice speaking in English as well. That's the fastest way to learn. I will be going through a couple more listening paper examples later on in the term. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful, and I will be uploading another lecture recording soon that focuses on Module A. So make sure that you read through this carefully. When you're doing your practice listening papers, always look back to this sheet